There is something I have noticed with Graves over the years. Whenever an item becomes too strong on ranged champions, Graves somehow ends up paying the price for it. And patch 26.16 is another perfect example. Both Black Cleaver and Sundered Sky were changed, and while these nerfs make sense from Riot's perspective, they are also another indirect nerf to Graves, a champion who didn't actually need to be targeted in the first place, at least not this way. So let's talk about what these changes actually mean for Bruiser Graves, why they hurt him, and why I still think Bruiser Graves is ridiculously strong. Let's start with Black Cleaver. Black Cleaver now gives Graves 5 more AD, which is obviously a good thing. More AD means more damage on his autos and abilities, and Graves is one of the champions that can make very good use of raw AD. But the problem is that he loses 10 movement speed, and movement speed is incredibly valuable on Graves. Graves is a short range champion. You constantly need to reposition yourself, kite enemies, get closer for better shotgun damage, dodge abilities, and use your E to move around fights. So losing 10 movement speed isn't something you can simply ignore. Yes, you get 5 extra AD, but that movement speed gave Graves a lot of combat power that isn't represented on the scoreboard. Then we have Sundered Sky. Sundered Sky loses some of its healing on ranged champions, and the missing head damage component is also reduced. On the other hand, the item gets 50 additional health. So once again, Graves loses some sustain and damage potential, but gains more of durability. And when you put these two things together, Bruiser Graves is definitely weaker than he was before. Less movement speed, less healing, less missing head damage, but more AD from Black Cleaver and more health from Sundered Sky. So is Bruiser Graves dead? Absolutely not. And honestly, I think this is where people can misunderstand why Bruiser Graves is so strong. The items are not the only reason this build works. The real monster is Graves himself. More specifically, his E. Graves E is one of the most ridiculous defensive abilities in the game when you understand how to use it properly. If you are positioning correctly and stacking your E before a fight, Graves can become incredibly difficult to kill, and this is something I think you absolutely have to master if you want to play Bruiser Graves. You cannot just press E randomly whenever you have it. You need to understand how your stacks work, when you can safely build them, and how much armor you are going to have when the actual fight starts. Because if you enter a fight with your E stacks already prepared, you are not fighting the same Graves as someone who walks into the fight with 0 stacks. You are essentially turning yourself into this incredibly annoying durable demon that refuses to die. And then you can combine that with Black Cleaver's health and armor shredding, Sundered Sky's health and sustain, Graves' natural burst damage, his smokescreen, his mobility, and the fact that his basic attacks can absolutely destroy people at close range. And you can see why Bruiser Graves remains so strong. The item nerfs definitely hurt. I'm not going to pretend they don't. But they don't remove the fundamental reason Bruiser Graves works. If anything, these changes make mastering Graves mechanics even more important, especially your E. If you are playing Bruiser Graves and you are not thinking about your E stacks before a fight, you are leaving a huge amount of power on the table. You should be thinking about how many stacks you can safely build before the fight starts. You should be thinking about where you are going to use your E. You should be thinking about whether you can afford to spend it for mobility or whether you need to preserve your armor. And most importantly, you need to position yourself so that your E keeps you alive instead of just using it as another dash. Because when you get that part right, the item nerfs become much less scary. And this is also where my frustration with these changes come from. Because once again, Graves is suffering from a problem that isn't really Graves' problem. Black Cleaver has been extremely valuable on champions like Senna and Smolder. Sundered Sky has also become incredibly powerful for certain users. And instead of directly addressing the champions that are abusing these items the most, Riot changes the items themselves, and Boo gets caught in the crossfire. Graves. We have seen this before. Do you remember Eclipse? Eclipse used to be one of the most important core items for Graves. It was an incredibly natural item for him, and it fit his playstyle perfectly. But Eclipse kept getting changed and nerfed over and over again, partly because other ranged champions were abusing the item in ways that were considered problematic. And eventually, Graves lost one of his most iconic core items. That's the frustrating part about playing Graves. He's technically range, so whenever Riot looks at an item and decides the range champions are abusing it, Graves gets put into the same category. But Graves doesn't play like Senna. Graves doesn't play like Smolder. He's not sitting at the back of a fight safely dealing damage from an enormous range. He's walking into your face. He's dashing around. He's using his E-stacks to become tankier. He's relying on positioning and spacing, and he's often taking just as much risk as the melee champions he's being compared to. Yet, because his attack type says ranged, he gets hit by the same item changes. And that's why I find these nerfs so frustrating. I'm not saying Riot shouldn't nerf Black Cleaver or Sundered Sky if they are genuinely too strong. If an item is causing problems across the game, it obviously needs to be addressed. But when the solution repeatedly ends up hurting Graves because other champions are abusing the exact same items more effectively, it starts becoming a pattern. And despite all of that, I still think Bruiser Graves is going to be extremely strong because the foundation of the build is still there. You still have your damage, you still have your mobility, you still have your armor stacking, you still have your burst, and most importantly, you still have an E. So yes, these changes are a nerf. Black Cleaver losing 10 movement speed hurts. Sundered Sky losing some of its sustain hurts. And Bruiser Graves will definitely feel weaker than before, but I don't think that's enough to kill the build. If anything, it just means that you have to play Graves properly. Prepare your E-stacks before fights, position correctly, know when to use your dash, don't throw away your defensive stats just for a little extra mobility. And once you master that, you realize that the items were never the entire reason Bruiser Graves was so strong. The items just made an already ridiculous champion even more ridiculous. So Riot can keep nerfing the items. They can keep changing them because Senna or Smolder are abusing them. But as long as Graves still has that E, I think Bruiser Graves is going to be just fine.